Aaron turned and looked around the parking lot. He had thought they were alone, but now he realized that, other than him and the pile of dust that used to be a cult leader, there were others who had witnessed the events. A short distance away, people who had been loading supplies in their cars and trucks were pointing at him. Thankfully, things had happened so fast that none of them had had time to pull out their phones and start recording before everything was over. And people further away had been too absorbed in their own errands to pay attention to a distant argument. Only a very small portion of the population was awakened and could actually see anything happening. To everyone else, it just sounded like a normal argument, if they could even hear it at all. And not everyone, especially not the kind of people red farmers that shop at Tractor Supply Company, were constantly recording everything in hopes of catching a major event that would give them a boost in visibility on the internet. Aaron, however, had scanned and recorded the entire process of Rick's disintegration. It was, after all, something he would very shortly need to get to the bottom of. Only after everything was over and done and the Imperial Police had arrived did he breathe a sigh of relief and rocket off, intent on boarding his personal shuttle and heading back to Avalon Island to supervise the aftermath. Give me an update on the situation, he said after he boarded his shuttle and began the journey back to the main cube. There were a number of large bombs discovered, but the Imperial Police successfully defused them. The cult was in the process of building new ANFO bombs, but they were intercepted in a rather weird way, Nova reported. Ed note. ANFO bombs are better known as fertilizer bombs. ANFO stands for ammonium nitrate fuel oil and was used by Timothy McVeigh in the Oklahoma Federal Building bombing of 1995, among other incidents. It's why fertilizer purchases are tracked and regulated by the government. Mythbusters also did quite a few episodes featuring ANFO. It was one of the most common explosives highlighted on the show, from what I recall. Here's a clip of them making a cement mixer disappear using it. Web links. Weird way? Aaron asked. He was pretty sure they had only targeted the cult's awakeners, so hearing that something weird happened to non-awakener cultists was a bit unexpected. The awakeners were successfully assassinated. 2,493 awakeners were targeted, of which 2,118 were neutralized by long-range sniping. The others were beheaded to ensure the kill. None of them were able to make any waves. But other than that, there are a number of people who are disintegrating in the same fashion as the cult leader, who we now know as Rick Ashley, a native of Montana who grew up in a militia compound, and we believe they were the cultists and other followers of the progenitor cult. The first instances of people disintegrating happened moments after you attacked the Fisk building and killed Mr. Ashley. Are they only happening here? While it did seem to be connected to the cult leader at first glance, correlation is not causation, so Aaron had to rule out some environmental factor or planned attack by an unknown cult awakener that had slipped the net. No, sir. The phenomenon is occurring all over the world. We're still getting reports of it happening, and the number is now in the hundreds of thousands and still increasing. There's a significant number of them that we've already identified as linked to the cult and we're tracking in Operation Hunting Dog, enough to statistically rule out other possibilities for the disintegrations, Nova said. She was paying attention to the reports and updating the numbers in real time as they came in. She waved her hand and a virtual screen appeared with a map of the world on it, littered with dots of different colors. Red dots were confirmed cultists that had disintegrated, yellow dots were for suspected cultists that were also disintegrating, and orange dots were for people unrelated to the cult, but were also disintegrating. Disturbingly, there were also blue dots here and there that represented Imperial citizens that had also died the same way. We don't yet know the mechanics of it, or why exactly it's happening, but from all the available evidence, it appears that the cult is dying with its leader. Aaron went silent after hearing Nova's report as he thought of why something like the disintegration phenomenon was happening. A few minutes before his shuttle reached Avalon Island, he came up with a working theory. It'll require further investigation, but I think what happened is likely to be related to Rick taking over another body after I killed him in his office. The death of his followers might be the price he had to pay, or perhaps, given the nature of the disintegrations, his followers are just being drained of enough mana to artificially awaken the new body. He recalled the mana vortex that had formed when he caught up to Rick in his new body and became more sure of his theory, but still said, "We'll look into it after everything's settled." But for now, I'll be resting. Aaron closed his eyes and leaned back in his seat, trying to rebalance his mental state. It was the first time he had personally taken action, and the experience was much different than simply ordering others to kill on his, or the Empire's, behalf. He hadn't expected that he would be affected at all, but reality had slapped him in the face. Nova went quiet, but that didn't mean she stopped working. She was still busy coordinating the cleanup of the various sites where cultists had disintegrated, including the personal effects they had on them when the phenomenon began. She, like Aaron, thought that his hypothesis was correct, but also like Aaron, she would fully investigate, looking for evidence for and against the HPO thesis before coming to a final conclusion. As could easily be expected, people panicked and immediately started coming up with explanations of just what the hell was happening. Crazy theories were thrown out like they were free, and people were blaming it on the aftereffects of using medical pods, a targeted mass assassination by the Empire, which was an especially popular theory, as most of the deaths occurred among non-imperial citizens, a blessing gone rogue, and the side effects of the increase in strange particle density causing people to fail to adapt to it. Those were just the most popular among the many theories being spread by panicking people or those abusing it to gain fame. At Black Dawn, the Empire is finally moving on us. Beware of those with overly solicitous behavior, because they all have ulterior motives. #masculine #the snap #the vanishing. At Cervantes. I don't think it's the Empire doing this at Black Dawn. It's more likely to be some blessed losing control over their superpower, or maybe just failure to adapt to the new particle density. #thinkmore #panicless #the snap #the vanishing. At Curtis 1122. At Cervantes at Black Dawn at Gaiatech at Imperial Press Corps tagging the Empire. Can you please explain this for us? What the hell is going on? #the snap #the vanishing. Ed note. Yes, I know that Avengers Infinity War came out in 2018, so it wouldn't normally be present in universe, but the deaths were so similar to what happened when Thanos snapped his fingers that we couldn't help but move its release date forward so it existed in universe here. Soon after seeing the trends on social media, the Imperial Press Agency released an emergency notification about the situation. They mentioned that it was still under investigation and that a formal response would be forthcoming as soon as the investigation yielded results. Anyone who wanted to follow the investigation was provided with a direct link to the Akashic record, where they could be updated with the progress in real time if they didn't want to wait for the official statement. That calmed the masses a little bit, at least, but speculation continued running rampant and the statement was even used by some as evidence of their speculations being true. The Imperial Health Agency was just as busy as the Imperial Press Agency. Though almost everyone affected by what Aaron believed to be Rick's death had died in an extremely spectacular fashion, some people, mostly Imperial citizens who were affected by the phenomenon, had survived on the precipice of death and were hanging by a thread. Those people were placed in newly printed stasis pods until the researchers had time to figure out what was going on and how to prevent it, or stop it in its tracks. At least stasis seemed to work, as it prevented their creeping decay from worsening. That said, however, they still looked like they had aged by at least 50 years. And it was hard aging at that, the kind that only underprivileged people would experience before the Empire was founded and the initial medical pod restoration was carried out. But for non-citizens, things were quite a bit more dire. Imperial citizens collapsed like balloons that had a small hole poked in them, allowing the air inside to slowly leak out. But non-citizens collapsed more like balloons that had been violently popped and simply disintegrated in a matter of seconds, or minutes at the longest. Thus far, they had only discovered a handful of non-citizens that had survived over an hour, during which time they were in excruciating agony as their bodies slowly collapsed and turned to dust before vanishing entirely. It was more evidence that people pointed to that proved the Empire was behind the attack. Nobody had yet linked the deaths to the cult, and if the anti-Empire sentiment continued growing, the chances of the truth being believed would be almost non-existent. Aaron was in the Emperor's council chamber, meeting with his inner council. After the greetings were finished, his expression turned grave and he said, "So just what the fuck is going on?" It's become more and more clear that everyone linked to the cult is dead, or dying, as a result of Rick Ashley's death. We don't yet understand the mechanics of it, but we're studying the citizens in stasis and expect to have results soon. We're at least sure that most of the Imperials that were affected are in no way linked to the cult, Gaia reported. Aaron heaved a sigh of relief. It seemed the Empire's cultist problem had resolved itself with the death of their leader, and he became even more certain of his earlier theory. It seemed that the mana drain effect had been applied to those who believed in the cult's propaganda enough to be connected to the leader in some way. Through that connection, he had, either consciously or subconsciously, stripped them of all their mana in an attempt to force the body he'd just taken over into awakening. On the bright side, there would be no survivors to form splinter factions and wreak their own brand of havoc, like similar terrorist organizations had in the past. How did you link them? And why are some Imperial citizens affected? He asked. Operation Hunting Dog had a lot of them already linked to the cult, either through financial contributions or material aid. There were also those linked to cells that we've already rolled up. There's hard evidence and paper trails of people contributing, the others are simply statistically likely to have been involved in cult activities through their social connections to confirmed cultists. It's circumstantial at best, but it holds water, Nix said. Aaron contemplated for a while, then nodded. I'm no idealist, so circumstantial evidence is enough for me, as long as there's enough of it. Did our operatives get any useful intel out of the cultists from Heartstein Point before they, I presume, vanished as well? Yes, Yusuf replied. They managed a full brain data download before the phenomenon began. We had a lucky break there, as one of the cultists captured was a member of Mr. Ashley's inner circle who was privy to almost all of their planning. Combined with the evidence from the reconstructed Fisk building in the simulation, we also have a full picture of the entire cult. He smiled wryly, then continued, our luck was their misfortune. Their reliance on analog methods and hard copies of information would have made it impossible to destroy everything even if we'd used a more traditional method of storming the building. We also now know what affinity the cult leader awakened. He awakened with an esoteric affinity to faith-aspected mana. Knowing that gives us some clues as to its operation, so we have avenues to research that will prevent it from affecting us going forward. We'll know if we've succeeded for sure once our affected citizens have their disintegration permanently stopped, Nova reported, as she was the one keeping track of the relevant research in the Lab City Gold Labs. That's a relief, Aaron sighed. About the evidence, is there any reason anyone can think of why we shouldn't make it public? There was a possibility that some of the cult's documents might need to be classified for national security, but as he had yet to receive a detailed briefing or any of the evidence himself, he couldn't say for sure. The human members of his inner council looked to the ice present at the meeting, as they hadn't had time to read through it themselves, either. There's some information in them with speculation that hits pretty close to the truth, Nix finally said. What speculations? Aaron asked. There's a trail of data that suggests the cult knew about our ability to read, store, and manipulate memory. Turns out the cultists I caught going into the simulation were simply just bait that the cult leadership threw out in order to prove or disprove their hypothesis. I apologize for missing that. I was too certain of my own abilities and our technological advantage and let those fish slip the net and did exactly what the cult researchers needed me to do. It's okay, Nix. Everyone makes mistakes. Aaron comforted the most human-like of his higher-order ice. Just don't let it happen again, understand? Yes, Your Imperial Majesty, Nix said, her usual laconic tone and expression replaced with grave solemnity as she dropped to one knee before him. I swear that I'll never repeat a mistake in the future. Good, the Emperor said, then turned to the rest of his inner council. We can classify that as gold-level information under Omega classification. It'll require keyword and letter clearance as well. Let's see, the keyword should be dump, and it'll be classified under the letter S. Ed note. Top secret isn't the highest classification level. Beyond top secret, there are a number of categories that are much higher, such as keyword clearance, letter clearance. For instance, nuclear secrets are classified under letters and nuclear programs are classified under keyword clearance need to know, and so on. There's a lot of them, and most aren't even publicly available even to hint at. Is there anything else that shouldn't be released? He continued. Nobody responded, showing that there was nothing else that should be excluded other than the aforementioned research data. Okay then. Gaia, release the information to Mnemosyne for classification, second eye passes, and release to the Akashic record. Nova, continue tracking the research in the Gold Lab and inform me as soon as there's an update on the situation of our affected citizens. Let them know it's likely mana drain, as the same thing happened during the assault on the cult compound in Washington. Nyx, Athena, and General Smith, send out our hunting dogs to search the cult cell's gathering points for any further information that might not have been present in the Fisk building. Jeremy and Yusuf, you'll be joining me later. We have an explanation to give and a victory speech to deliver to all of humanity, not just the citizens of the Empire, Aaron ordered. If there's no further business or additions, he looked around at those present in the council chamber, then continued, and I see that there isn't, so meeting adjourned. With that, everyone in the council chamber disappeared to prepare for the follow-up of the cult's destruction, leaving Aaron alone in his council chamber. Soon, he, too, logged out of the simulation and returned to reality. Though he had a speech to prepare, he needed to first heal his heart with his loved ones. Taking action himself was still affecting him. Even though his mental state had stabilized, his emotions were still running amok and he needed to ground himself. And though Nova was an excellent counselor and therapist, the only thing that could heal a soldier's heart was love. Love was one thing that he would never have with Nova. Or at least, not the kind of love he needed at that particular moment in time. 10 minutes later, on the roof of the cube at Avalon Island. Aaron and Rena were back in their spot, on the roof of the enormous Imperial government edifice, lying cuddled together and gazing up at the sky. Do you think life is sacred? He asked. Rena pondered the question for a long moment, then sighed and shook her head. No, life is a cosmic accident, not something sacred or precious. If you create or remove a single life from the equation, the world doesn't stop turning, the sky doesn't weep blood, rivers keep flowing, and the tides keep, well, tiding, I guess. She shrugged. She paused for a moment before adding, but it also depends on what and who you're talking about. If it's your life, it's sacred to me. Just like I hope mine is to you. It's all about perspective. But the point is, in the grand scheme of things, life is just life. It's chaos from beginning to end, and chaos cannot, by definition, be sacred. At least not in an absolute, objective sense of the word, anyway. The pair of lovers lapsed into a companionable silence for a time, then Aaron finally broke the silence by saying, "Something weird happened when I was confronting Rick earlier." Oh, Rena prompted. Yeah, I heard a voice. I'm pretty sure it was the esoteric mana that he awakened to. What did it say? Aaron waved his hand and a video of his confrontation with Rick, recorded from Aaron's perspective, played on a virtual screen for him and Rena. Weirdly, however, the voice of the mana wasn't caught on it, nor was the mana vortex. He backed the video up to the point where the vortex first formed and manually added the details he recalled to the video file as it played, then paused it where the voice spoke and said, "Here's where it spoke to me." It said, "You win for now," before the vortex finally dissipated. And I can't help but wonder what it meant by that. It's fine, Rena said. I'm sure you'll figure it out in the end. You are, after all, the most brilliant man who ever lived. Before the panic and fearmongering could spread further, a notification was pushed to every device on the planet, Imperial or otherwise. The Emperor would shortly be making a speech explaining the whys and wherefores of the disintegrations. The notification was enough to bring everything in the world to a screeching halt, as, other than those who were asleep and thus missed it or those doing important jobs, everyone sat and stared at their screens, upon which was displayed the Imperial seal. Everyone was worried that the disintegration would be affecting them, their families, or their close friends, and they wanted to know what exactly was going on. And whether they were Imperial citizens or not, Aaron had an excellent reputation, so his words bore the most authority. As usual, Aaron appeared behind a podium against a neutral blue backdrop, the seal of the Empire proudly displayed on the front of the podium. Greetings to everyone around the world, he began in a neutral tone. Earlier this year, the world suffered an unprecedented wave of terror attacks that took the lives of millions of people. And at that time, we swore a solemn vow to all of you. And today, we come before you to announce that we have kept our promise and the cult of the progenitors has been eliminated to the very last man. He paused to let the news sink in as the screen behind him played a clip from his previous speech where he swore to end the terrorist threat immediately after the attacks took place. In addition to that, we have information on the wave of disintegrations and premature aging sweeping through the world. It's the last gasp of the cult in its dying throes, he said, dropping another bomb as if he was AB-52 during World War II. Everyone who turned to dust or aged by decades was connected to the cult in some way. Those who were disintegrated were directly involved in the cult's activities, whether by active participation or even something as simple as donating funds or equipment to their cause. And those suffering from premature aging were forced to cooperate with the cultists against their will. Yes, there were indeed imperial citizens among them, and no, our empire doesn't have the technology to invisibly disintegrate someone. Even if we did, wouldn't it be a wasteful, unfair, and easy end to use it on people who deserve to receive punishment for their crimes and repent through service? Most of those watching understood the concept of crimes being punished by community service. Almost every country on the planet, prior to the founding of the empire, had that option available for criminals. After all, not every crime was deserving of jail time, let alone capital punishment. Aaron's speech went on as people continued pondering the punishment issue. That said, it doesn't mean that we don't have an explanation of what happened and what caused it. The cult leader, who we now know to have been one Rick Ashley, was born and raised in a militia compound in Montana in the United States. He was one of the 3%ers, and his blessing was the power to instill belief in him, harvest it, and control others through his powers. We understand your doubts. Mr. Ashley was well over the age of people who underwent the blessing process, but we have to remind you of something. The day of the terrorist attacks was also the day that the first person began receiving their blessing. And that first person is none other than the late cult leader, Rick Ashley. The thousands of terrorists that believed in him strongly enough to sacrifice themselves in the suicidal attacks was what triggered the blessings to descend. After a thorough investigation, our investigators discovered that the first of those to be blessed was the cult leader himself. His action of mass human sacrifice, both of his own followers and of innocent people, was the final blow to an already cracked and weakened dam that held back the flood of blessings. It was also what led to his specific blessing, which we will call the power of faith. Through that power, he was able to gather information from malcontents in the empire, as well as assume direct control of those who believed in him. Another aspect of it was that he was able to force people who otherwise wouldn't obey him into obedience and compliance with his demands. Aaron's gaze grew stern as he continued. Before he died, he was working on another attack that would have taken place during the New Year celebration. The plan our investigators uncovered was that he would control thousands of blessed people to wreak havoc and cause massive casualties, then frame it as an imperial attack on non-citizens. Thankfully, our people were able to discover his plans before they could be carried out, and in a coordinated strike, eliminated all of the brainwashed and reprogrammed blessed that he had gathered in Amarillo, Texas. He paused to let people consider the potential consequences of an attack like that, then changed the subject. During the operation to eliminate the clear and present danger to humanity, Mr. Ashley was also eliminated. And as a result of his elimination, those who were voluntarily connected to him suffered the same fate as him, disintegration. But that wasn't all. Only those who were willing believers in the cult's anti-human rhetoric were turned to dust. Those who were forced to believe are also slowly dying, and our researchers are currently searching for a cure to the phenomenon. Right now, our imperial doctors are able to place the victims in suspended animation, putting a temporary halt to the disintegration process, but that is only a temporary solution. And it's one that we are willing to extend to non-citizens as a courtesy and to alleviate the suffering of the innocent victims who were pulled into the cult leaders' schemes. So if you or anyone you know has been affected by the fallout of the cult's demise, please contact your nearest imperial embassy or consulate and ask to speak with the outreach specialist. Aaron grabbed the sides of the podium as he brought his speech to a close. We founded the Terran Empire with the idea that humanity needs to stand united as one in order to face the inevitability of a hostile universe. Even if the visitors that are currently on their way to our solar system are friendly, who can guarantee that the next visitors will also be friendly? or the one after that. So even if you chose to decline the offer of imperial citizenship at the empire's founding, our doors will always remain open to you, and our goal is not to make you suffer, but to allow you the freedom to choose your path. And as such, we will definitely not let you suffer the consequences of an attack on us. Not now, and not ever. Aaron had decreed that the remaining days of December would be an imperial holiday. As such, everyone was given the option of taking the 10 days off for a paid holiday, or choosing to work for double pay. That included both government employees and private companies alike, a move that was popular with employees, but not nearly as popular with the enterprises employing them. As for himself, on the other hand, he was still working without pay. After all, he had never taken a salary from the imperial treasury to begin with, save a ceremonial one end per year. Even as the emperor, he was still a government employee, so he had to be paid. But since the money was irrelevant to him, he only accepted a token pittance. He was currently in his office dealing with state affairs. With this, he sighed in relief. The case of the progenitor cult can be considered closed. He flicked his eyes to the scanner and linked the final document to his retinal pattern and other biometric data, a measure that would ensure the information in the case file would be classified as deeply as it could. The information contained in the investigation file was the very definition of highly dangerous, and as such it would be for the best if it were to never see the light of day again at all. We got lucky, Nova. If the cult had known how to train their own awakeners, instead of blindly fumbling about and failing as often as they succeeded, they could have been a much, much bigger problem, he said, wiping a drop of non-existent sweat from his brow. Indeed, sir, and that would have made it far more difficult to stop as well. If he'd scattered the cult's awakeners around the world ahead of time instead of gathering them all in Amarillo for training, we wouldn't have been able to identify and remove them before their programming activated and they started a slaughter. Our luck, I think, was that we happened to catch one of the inner circle in Washington, and you happened to trace his mana back to him. If you hadn't drained all the mana in the surrounding area, it would have been lost in the background noise, Nova said. Another part of our luck is that Mr. Ashley himself didn't understand how to use his affinity. Beg pardon, sir. Nova tilted her head, something she had seen humans do when they were confused and seeking clarification on a point in conversation. If I were him, I would have kept even lower. Made a show of disbanding the cult entirely and gone deep, deep underground. So deep that nobody would ever notice my existence. And he had the tools to do just that without ever being discovered. How so? He could take people over and force compliance, right? Yes, he could. But with our brain data updating every time they used a piece of DR gear, wouldn't that have been discovered? That was his mistake. He didn't just take people over, he programmed them to act on his behalf. If he'd just taken them over and ordered them to forget they were taken over and act completely normal, the consequences to the Empire would have been devastating once all of those individuals were activated. I see. If nothing out of the ordinary was detected on our regular updates of their brain data, then he would have been able to continue taking over more and more people, up to and including our awakeners. Exactly. And that's what frightens me. Mana is a huge evolutionary step for the human species, but it's equally devastating. It's the equivalent to stepping into the nuclear power age in the 1940s and 50s, except instead of a few governments in control, it's everyone having their own nuclear arsenal. And even worse, he sighed and trailed off, massaging his temples. Even worse, sir, Nova prompted. Even worse, it didn't start with rational humans. The evolution began with irrational people during the time when we're the least in control of ourselves, puberty. I see your point. That is frightening. And it's completely human nature, too. Do you know what most protest movements, anarchist groups, and eco-terrorist organizations of the 18th and 19th century have in common? They recruit their members at a young age, sir. Exactly. Anti-capitalist movements like the 99%, anarchist groups like Anonymous and other hacktivist collectives, and even eco-terrorist groups like the Earth Liberation Front consisted almost entirely of people between the ages of 18 and 25. It's something people eventually grow out of, but unfortunately, now that same age range almost entirely overlaps with the age range of people who unexpectedly gain real power. So how do we prevent something like that from happening in the future? Aaron asked. I suggest a treaty, sir. You offer imperial training of non-imperial awakeners, but they'll be required to follow imperial law. There are enough of them blowing themselves up or going brain dead from mana backlash that I think the suggestion would be received fairly well. That could work. We could make it a part of Operation Boiling Frog. Operation Boiling Frog, sir? Nova asked, puzzled. There's a saying about boiling frogs. If you don't want them to jump out of the pot, you put them in cold water and slowly bring it to a boil so they don't realize the temperature is rising and jump out, Aaron said. But that would never work, sir. I know. It's just a saying. Aaron stood and brought up a screen, then started filling it with plans for the next 4 years. By the year 5A, I want there to be no one on Earth who isn't an Imperial citizen, he said, continuing to flesh out his plans. I see, sir. And the way we're going to do that is the same way as frogs get boiled. And we can start with Awakeners. As long as they accept our trade of training for patrollers and enforcement, everything else will fall into place like a line of dominoes. I'll inform the Minister of the Exterior, Nova said, then flickered for a moment. Message sent, sir. Now, don't you have a wedding to plan? Shit, I almost forgot. Aaron waved his hand to dismiss the screen in front of him and initiated his emergency logout procedure. Felix looked at Aaron with a face full of disbelief. Man, I know you're the Emperor and above us mere plebeians, but, really? He asked in surprise as he swiped his hand across in front of him, closing the file he had been reading. What's the problem this time? Aaron shot back, rolling his eyes. You have less than 10 friends. 10. Doesn't that make you the least social royal in the history of the world? And, half of those are the people you dragged in to be the CEOs of your companies using magical contracts. Felix scoffed. He jokingly continued, can you even consider that friendship? And besides me and Sarah, don't you have any friends from your time in school? You seem to have forgotten how everything started. You and Sarah are the only two people that stuck with me when Rodham Morgan threw his little hissy fit and had me expelled under false pretenses after I proved him wrong in public. So however many I have now, it's still more than 2. Aaron playfully punched Felix's arm, causing him to wince and rub it. That means it's a net gain, regardless. Shouldn't you be congratulating me on my awe-inspiring social skills? He struck an arrogant pose and looked down on his friend. Oh, really? Have you ever spent time with any of them without them being required to be there? Aaron went quiet, thinking back over the past few years and trying to recall if he had ever spent any downtime with his other friends, outside of board meetings or formal events. Not finding any instances that he could recall, he realized that he had only ever spent time with them when they were required to be with him, and his shoulders slumped a bit. Sarah slapped Felix in the back of his head and he turned and pouted at her. Knock it off, you two. Play nice, she said. The 3 friends went quiet for a while, then Aaron said, but I have more than 500 people I can invite to my wedding. He looked at Felix and Sarah with a smile that positively dripped with faked arrogance and true pride. What about you two? Do you have 500 people you can invite to your wedding? Sarah blushed all the way down to her chest. She was wearing a spaghetti strap tank top and had fair, Irish skin, so the blush was very obvious. WHWH, what wedding? She spluttered. Felix, too, stammered something but couldn't quite spit it out. Aaron looked at his friends and laughed, having scored another point in the trio's long-running game where they tried to provoke each other into speechlessness. He tossed another file to Felix and displayed it on a holoscreen in front of him. What's this? Felix asked. The file Aaron had thrown him was named guest_list. QD, and it indeed had more than 500 names neatly arranged in categories by how close Aaron was to them. He scanned the list and a subtle frown crossed his brow. Why invite Ares troops to your wedding? He asked. Are you expecting an attack? I mean, I can understand inviting John, since he's a minister, and of course you'll be inviting government officials of sufficient rank. But what about the rest of them? If someone's going to cause trouble at your wedding, maybe you should hold it in the simulation instead of reality. No, I'm not expecting any trouble at the wedding, and no, I can't hold it in the simulation. It has to be held in reality. We can't do all of our government functions, social or not, strictly in the simulation. Those troopers are just the first members of Ares, the ones that I personally recruited and interacted with face to face, Aaron answered. So what about the scientists? You haven't interacted with any of them face to face. I may not know them personally, perhaps, but I've been working with them in Lab City for centuries since stealing their brain data. So they deserve at least that much as the beginning of their compensation, Aaron replied. Lab City was no secret from his inner circle. The only thing that was kept from them was the existence of the system. After all, as the saying goes, use the ones you trust, and don't use the ones you don't trust. And Aaron definitely trusted his oldest friends. I suppose that makes sense. But aren't you worried about them possibly discovering something fishy about the situation? Felix followed up. Well, yes and no. It isn't like I absolutely have to tell them it's compensation, you know. After all, they're all incredible researchers that push the boundaries of science on a daily basis, and my empire is going to be a science-focused one. We need to push our tech level as far as we can as fast as we can, Aaron answered, slightly bringing down the mood as everyone there was reminded that they were on something of a doomsday clock. But that's beside the point, he continued. We're here for a happy occasion, we have a wedding to plan. Everyone at the table took a moment to readjust their mindset, and Felix lightened the mood by clowning around as they picked up where they left off in their planning. The guest list was the first thing to be worked on, and, between Aaron and Rena, the guest list rapidly climbed to the thousands. It included close family members, close friends, work acquaintances, government officials, scientists, teachers, influential people, and Sarah even managed to get a lottery-style lucky draw contingent added to the list. After all, it wouldn't be very politically proper to introduce class divisions when Aaron had been working so hard to eliminate all divisions that had historically plagued humanity. Then they moved on to the venue, where it was decided that the wedding would be held in reality at a government tower that they would rush to complete. It would be hard to find a venue that could fit all of the guests they had invited while still having some form of meaning and pomp and circumstance to it. Sure, they could hold it at a sporting arena if they wanted to, but it wouldn't have the same sense of gravitas that a newly completed government tower would. And although they would be holding the wedding in reality, it would also be open to everyone in the public simulation via livestream and those watching from home on other assorted devices. That way everyone could either say they were there or watched it live. So everything's final then? Rena asked, gesturing to the list of people eligible for the lucky draw attendance at their wedding. Ah, wait, there's a girl that asked me for an autograph when I was on my European tour. Come to think of it, I wonder if she ever solved the problem I gave her. Aaron looked around and saw the strange expressions on the other people at the table with him. He suddenly realized how what he had said could be misinterpreted and sputtered, why you people? Who do you think I am? Sheesh. She was the front desk attendant when I was checking out of the hotel and she recognized me and asked for an autograph. That would have been that, until Nova looked through her information and discovered she was a talented engineer, so she set a question that, if the girl answered it correctly, she'd find some rewards from Nova. He shuddered at the cold shoulder he was expecting from Rena later. Even though he was almost positive they were just fucking with him, he had a sinking suspicion that he would be sleeping alone tonight. Everyone went silent for a few seconds, then Sarah coughed in an attempt to disguise her laughter and the silence broke as everyone started chuckling. Everyone, that is, except Aaron, who was less than impressed to have been made the butt of the joke. She did, sir. She's currently an employee at Hephaestus and was one of the engineers that helped with the final touches on the Fortress City designs, Nova said against the backdrop of Aaron's friends' laughter. Add her to the list for a chance to attend my wedding in person, Aaron said. Yes, sir, she replied. She added the girl to the list and asked, she's on it, sir. Anyone else? I think that should be everyone, right? Aaron said as he swept his gaze across the other people at the table. They all shook their heads, indicating that they were fine with the lists as they stood. Looks like everything's settled, Rena said with a content smile on her face. Everyone she wanted to attend her wedding was already on the guest list. Even her father, who was still in jail serving his sentence, would be granted leave to attend the wedding. It was a privilege that was extended to all prisoners who were on good behavior and weren't facing execution for their crimes. If that's all, then we shall bid you two lovebirds adieu. Rena and I have somewhere to be that isn't shining a light on your romantic world, Aaron said with a grin. He took Rena's hand and walked out of the room, leaving Felix and Sarah to their own little pink bubble. The last thing Aaron heard as he was walking out of the room was Sarah asking Felix, "So, how many kids do you want?" Rena covered her mouth with her hand and snickered when Aaron threw her the sound clip as they were walking down the hall. A peculiar-looking helicopter landed atop a luxurious skyscraper in Istanbul, attracting the attention of all who saw it. Only one person could be a passenger in that helicopter, and everyone knew who it was because of the ostentatious imperial seal on its doors. The emperor's private seal was above the imperial seal, displayed in its full majesty, and everyone knew what it meant with just a glance. They had seen it more than once, after all, and every time it was either a very important occasion or some event that would change the lives of many, many people. The peculiar helicopters were also something of an imperial fashion statement as well. Even though every vehicle introduced by the empire, whether it came from one of the emperor's companies or not, was at his disposal, he would choose to travel in this particular style of helicopter each time. It wasn't the most advanced, nor was it the fastest, or the heaviest armed, and it wasn't even the most luxurious. It was, in fact, one of the older designs, and one that had faded out of use since the invention of gravity plating. What it had going for it, however, was one simple fact: the Emperor of the Terran Empire seemed to prefer using it. "Welcome to the House of Hope, Your Majesty and Your Highnesses," a man of Indian descent said as he extended a hand to welcome Aaron, Rena, and Henry. "You don't seem too happy to see me, Jay. You're even sweating a bit," Aaron said with a smile. "To be fair, Your Majesty, we weren't informed you would be arriving until you were about a minute away. So I had to drop everything and sprint all the way here." Jay Chakrabarti, CEO of the Koyos Foundation, laughed, pulling a neatly folded handkerchief out of his jacket's breast pocket and wiping the sweat from his brow with it. "Well, are you hiding something?" Aaron grinned. "Unfortunately, Your Majesty, I'll have to disappoint you. There's nothing to hide in the first place, whether it be public or private." "Then what's with that go-doffel expression, man? Lighten up a bit, will you?" Aaron patted him on the shoulder. "We need time to prepare to welcome you, Your Majesty. A surprise visit from the Emperor of all mankind is probably the very last thing we expect on any given day. There's hundreds of children living here, Jay. If it isn't always in a condition I can see without prior warning of my arrival, that just means it isn't fit for children to live here in the first place." Aaron's tone grew serious as he continued, "So is that the case, Mr. Chakrabarti?" "Let's go in and you can see for yourself, Your Majesty," Jay said as he pointed at the elevator that had been waiting for them throughout the conversation so far. "Sure, let's go have a look, shall we?" Aaron took Henry's hand in his and wrapped his other arm around Rena's waist, then followed Jay to the elevator as his Emperor's Aegis airdropped in throughout the entire area, making that particular neighborhood one of the safest places on Earth. Aaron, Rena, and Jay were having a conversation in a room filled with toys, playmats, and small desks. 3 of its walls were decorated with children's art in bright primary colors and shapes, and a digital display adorned one wall. The sound of children at play drifted in from the windows. "We've established a presence in every city in the world after finishing the last round of renovations. We're still negotiating with non-citizens to purchase land from them so we can build our own schools, but that's taking more time than we initially expected. We may actually have to continue using the renovated buildings until the completion of the fortress cities, since we're now responsible for a little under 100 million orphan children around the world and the locals are putting up stumbling blocks in our acquisition negotiations," Jay said, his tone a mixture of satisfaction and frustration. The total number of children being looked after by the Koyos Foundation made them the world's largest privately owned orphanage, which was something Jay was definitely proud of. In his care was more than 95% of the world's orphans under the age of 18. And over the past years the foundation had been operating, the number was even higher and the Hope alumni had already begun contributing their share to the good work being done. "How much are we spending every year for the entire House of Hope program?" Aaron asked. Due to the stringent requirements for quality that you specifically demand, everything comes to around 100 billion end monthly, or 1.2 trillion end yearly, give or take. Sometimes less, sometimes more. It really depends on one-time expenses like large purchases or construction, which we always use local contractors for. The 1.2 trillion figure only accounts for regular costs, like building maintenance and groundskeeping, the salaries of matrons, teachers, and healthcare professionals, ensuring the security of our campuses, and food, among other things. At first, Jay had been somewhat overwhelmed by the large numbers he was working with as a part of the Koyos Foundation. After all, he may have been born wealthy, but he had never handled this much money before. He had soon worked through his mental block, however, which was a good thing. After all, that 1.2 trillion was merely one of the projects his foundation was responsible for. If it's just that much, there's no problem with your spend. Don't skimp on things in order to remain below your budget. You only need to report for the House of Hope program if your spending crosses the 2 trillion threshold. Over that, I'll need an audit report on the books, but under that. Aaron waved his hand. Consider it petty cash. I'll keep that in mind, Jay said, surprised. He'd been worried that Aaron might be upset over the spending and had been prepared to put up a fight to keep the funding available, so the actual nonchalance in the Emperor's response left him feeling like all of his preparation time would have been better spent feeding dogs. So let's begin the tour, Jay said as he stood and respectfully gestured to the door of the classroom the group was in. Rena's face was full of excitement as she couldn't wait any longer to go spend time with the children. And as for Henry, he hadn't been there to begin with. His was one of the laughing voices drifting through the window from the playground outside. 5 hours later. Until we meet again, Your Majesty, Jay said as he and a few of the workers bid Aaron farewell. Henry had exhausted himself and was asleep, piggybacking on Aaron and drooling on his shoulder after 4 hours straight of playing with his new friends. I enjoyed the visit, and it seems like Prince Henry did as well. So we'll most likely be visiting again in the future, or at least Prince Henry will, Aaron replied as he shifted Henry's position to limit the drool somewhat. Rena seemed to have also greatly enjoyed her time at the House of Hope as well, given the brilliant smile on her face every time Aaron had laid eyes on her. You're welcome any time, Your Majesty, Jay said with sincerity in his voice, then turned to Rena. Your Highnesses are welcome as well, the children really enjoyed having you here. We'll keep that in mind, Mr. Chakrabarti, Aaron said, then boarded his waiting helicopter, which immediately left. You look tired too, Aaron said to Rena as he laid his little brother in a reclined seat and strapped him in. You should take a nap. I will, in a little bit. First, though, I have to admit that I'm rather curious about the House of Hope project and have a few questions. Ask away. I know you hate people living disadvantaged lives when they don't have to, so that's probably the main reason you're spending all this money to raise orphans. But I can't help but wonder if you have any ulterior motives as well, so, do you? She bluntly asked. Why should she let questions eat her from the inside when she knows that Aaron would always give honest answers to any question she asks him? He would also never judge her, either, a luxury she greatly appreciated after having been brought up in an old money family where judgment was the only constant. Aaron smiled and answered, yes, there's a plan, though bringing it to fruition is contingent on a specific change in Earth's recent circumstances. So spill it, mister, what's that devious mind of yours plotting? She asked, curiosity having fully replaced fatigue in her mind. Instead of answering her outright, Aaron simply asked, what's the age limit of the people in the program? From birth to 18, just like any other orphanage. Rena's eyes bulged as she realized Aaron's plan from the question he posed to her. Are you planning what I think you're planning? Aaron simply smiled and pulled her head over to rest on his shoulder. Aaron nodded. It's exactly what you think, he said. The awakening phenomenon isn't over, and when people reach the early stages of puberty, the clock will start ticking down to their eventual awakenings as well. Thankfully, though, the process will be much smoother as it won't be as abrupt as the first awakening was. So, to prevent the orphans who are soon to awaken, the House of Hope plan was brought forward and made the main thrust of the Koyos Foundation's activities. We will guide the newly awakened through their growth phase and seamlessly shift them into hero academies, as they reach the age of awakening. That serves a dual purpose. First, it'll prevent them from their desperation driving them to a life of crime, and second, it'll guide them into working for the Empire instead of becoming part of private forces in the hands of non-citizens. Prior to the mass awakening of the 3%, we'd already made plans for the House of Hope project, but at that time, it was meant to raise generations of people who would be staunch imperial loyalists. We would raise them, teach them, and train them to work in whatever sector we needed them, but that became infeasible after the mana density reached critical mass. Aaron stopped speaking and waited for his fiancée's mind to catch up. She was a very intelligent and quick-witted woman, but exhaustion makes fools of the best. He sneakily carved a refresh rune in the air and pressed it to her, clearing the fog from her mind, then waited for her response. The silence stretched for a moment as Rena's face scrunched up in thought. Then she finally asked, "You said there were other reasons. What are they?" At the time, unemployment, especially among the uneducated, was on the rise. If we hadn't done something to combat it, it would have led to an unrecoverable tailspin into another economic depression. So we overstaffed all of our programs that were run through the Koyos Foundation as part of that. With a staff-to-child ratio of 1 to 5, that provided 20 million jobs to people who were of good character, firm convictions, and strong morals through the House of Hope program alone. Most of them work as caregivers and have been put through a crash course in early childhood education, but we also hired a lot of people that were made redundant in the fields of healthcare, as well as former orphanage staff members from around the world. We even went so far as to ensure that each House of Hope we built or renovated was multicultural to help break the cycle of ignorance that leads to issues like racism and sexism. We also focused on recruiting staff members that had lost their own children, either to miscarriages or other, more violent, incidents. The goal is to raise the children to be morally upright and righteous in their convictions, and firm in their determination to do good to the benefit of humanity, after all. Aaron and Jay were investing in the future, raising these children to be dominoes in a long chain, whose good behavior and willingness to fight against injustice would build a better environment for humanity as a whole from the very ground up. It would be a generational change, and as such it would be more solid than anything the Empire could enforce on people from the top down. If you want to change the world, you must first change the children. That said, we won't be forcing anything on the children. Instead, we'll guide them and winnow the wheat from the chaff through multiple evaluations. None of us are so immature that we'll believe in the inherent goodness of man or some bullshit like that. Some children, despite their guardians' best efforts, are simply irredeemable. So those children, we'll subtly separate from the rest and provide them an upbringing that encourages them to find a place they can express their nature without being punished for doing so. Like Ares, Rena interjected. After all, in most situations, arson, murder, and bombings would get one thrown in prison. But in the military, those same actions would get those same people rewarded with medals and glory. Indeed, Aaron smiled. We'll subtly manipulate them into joining our military, where their talents will also be put to use. Over the years they're being raised in the House of Hope, they will never, not once, be unmonitored, and all of their actions and talents will determine their futures. And even if only a minority of them join the imperial government, it's still worth it. Besides, the alternative is for them to end up on the streets or as victims of forced prostitution, sweatshops, organ farms. The list of potential bad ends for orphans goes on, especially those who have been picked up by shady, underfunded orphanages relying on unreliable donations or criminal consortiums backing them. The House of Hope program is a closed orphanage system that will not allow for adoption or outside fostering of the children we raise in it. If anything, it's more like a boarding school for all ages, where the caregivers care for the children care for the younger children, and all of them are given the best of the best when it comes to providing them with the tools to lead a successful, happy life once they age out and become Hope alumni. Now I'm really curious to see how the so-called Hope alumni influence the Empire in the future, Rena said with a smile. Currently, the Empire was being held together by spit, chewing gum, and baling wire, through Aaron's overwhelming military might and technological prowess. No one was foolish enough to think that all Imperial citizens had been completely willing when they joined the Empire. They were merely in it either in pursuit of the benefits offered to imperial citizens, or in fear of the dystopian nightmare that they felt non-citizens would be suffering through once the fortress cities were complete and the two societies finally completely separated. Thus, raising his own imperial adherents was a masterstroke of planning from Aaron's side and displayed his forward thinking. It was becoming more obvious as time passed that the Terran Empire would long outlive its founder and first emperor, and Rena, whose curiosity was finally sated, closed her eyes and drifted off to sleep. Somewhere in the solar system, an asteroid the size of one of Mars' moons floated alone in orbit around the Sun, in all its majesty. Formerly a cosmic dust-covered rock, it had been completely worked over and half of it had been cut off, leaving a flat surface from which grew an enormous docking tower. The half that remained was still a natural rock, though the cosmic dust coating it had been swept away, leaving the surface clean, while the docking tower was made of a dark gray Hadfield steel alloy, as most of the Empire's hardware in space was. A study in contrasts, the natural half of the asteroid was dark, while the docking tower was brightly lit with brilliant flashing lights and painted signage highlighting the various docking bays of different sizes. Ed note. Picture Omega, from Mass Effect 2. Outpost 134. This is ISAEV 343398 on leading approach, requesting approach lane and docking assignment, the captain of a kilometer-long vessel reported. Outpost 134 copies requesting approach lane and docking assignment. Come to zero thrust and prepare for inspection, 343,398, the tower replied. Roger, coming to zero thrust and rolling out the welcome mat, 134. 343,398 out. A bright yellow light shone from the tip of the docking tower on the Imperial outpost and flashed over the exploration vessel. It turned green and the comms crackled to life again. Welcome to Outpost 134, 343,398. You're assigned to Docking Ring 7, Dock 71 Alpha. Please be advised that you and your crew will be subject to Ares authority while docked and that most of the outpost is restricted to civilian personnel. Trespassers will be dealt with expediently. With that out of the way, enjoy your shore leave, and Happy New Year. Outpost 134 out. Inside ISAEV 343398. Despite spending more than 6 months in deep space, the beauty hasn't faded, Captain Kim Miller thought. She had never imagined she would be able to even ride to orbit, much less deep space in the solar system, and had given up on her childhood dreams when she turned 30. Who would have imagined that, 11 years later, she would be at the helm of an enormous spaceship overseeing the docking procedure with a space station that could only have come from the fever dream of one of the authors she grew up reading? Definitely not her, that was certain. Helm, line us up for the catch and reverse thrust to -1500 FPS relative, she ordered. Aye ma'am, lining her up and preparing for catch maneuver, the helmsman replied. The ship's executive officer, Dennis Campbell, tugged the imaginary wrinkles out of his uniform as he stood beside the captain and gazed at the display on the fore bulkhead of the bridge. I'll never get used to this, I think, he said. I mean, it'd be one thing if all of the outposts were built to a standard template, but we've visited an average of one outpost every 2 weeks and they've all got their own character. Isn't that amazing, Captain? Status report, Mr. Campbell. Save the observations for when we're not docking a million-ton vessel with an outpost the size of Deimos and focus on the task in front of you, the captain rebuked. Aye, ma'am. All stations reporting all green and cleared for the catch, the XO reported, feeling chastened. Captain Miller was right. Even though it was a routine procedure, they had experienced enough potential catastrophic failures during their training in the simulation to know that they needed 100% of their focus when performing the complex lineup and catch procedure. Ed note. When docking with a moving object that's in orbit in space, the vessel docking begins the procedure ahead of the object they're docking with. Then they come to zero relative velocity, the same speed as the thing they're docking with, and line up with the docking port before slowing down and letting the bigger object catch up to them before finally docking. Hence, line up and catch. Captain Miller acknowledged the report, then asked, 398, any update on our schedule? No, Ma'am, nothing in the database right now, just a week of shore leave for the New Year celebrations and a note to attend a briefing on station here in Outpost 134, the ship's AI replied. Looks like we've got some proper shore leave this time, not just a refuel and refit cycle, the ship's engineer, Scotty, excitedly said. No matter what their name was before joining the Imperial Space Agency, all ships' engineers were called Scotty, just like all medics in every branch of the military were called Doc. Scotty had joined the dangerous exploration mission for two reasons. The first was curiosity. He just plain wanted to know what was out there and whether it would go bump in the night or be like diving into a pot of gold. And the second reason was the generous bonuses he could earn. Bonuses that would go a very long way toward supporting himself in a manner that he would like to become accustomed to. After all, the strict regulation the Empire was still under while its fledgling economy grew to a point where it would be independently viable ensured that 500 END was enough to survive in the Empire. But there was a vast gulf between survive and thrive, and he desperately desired to bridge that divide by sating his curiosity. It would be killing two birds with one stone. Going into the program, he had thought that it would be more dangerous than it had proved in actual practice. The only times he had died were all in the simulators, where the crew's instructors would throw them into desperate situation after desperate situation, waiting for them to fail so they could chew them out afterward. Eventually, however, they began succeeding, and their number of successes grew until they had been assigned to an exploration vessel. Thus, he was caught unawares by how easy the job of ship's engineer was made by the automated maintenance bots and constructor swarms at his disposal. The only times he would have to step in would be when the multiple layers of fail-safes failed and left him as the sole bulwark between a successful mission and a failure that led to some, if not all, of the crew dying miserably when all systems went down and the vessel went Dutchman. He supposed that was the reason that justified the large bonuses he was paid. The risk of space exploration was minute, but very, very real.